We have one thing left. It's the home stretch. I'm glad to see a lot of people here. It's always, you save the best for last. And this is to outline our legacy, or to give our first legacy award to Dr. Tucker LeBien. And I'm going to call him up here in a few seconds, but I want to put this in an important perspective. So there are a couple of things I want to just point out is that if you noticed, Dr. LaRusso and Dr. I mentioned that when the National Cancer Act was signed in 1971, that's when the Cancer Center mechanism was really formalized. Then, if you're paying to the detail to what I said next, we did not apply for that grant until 1990, or we did not exist as a cancer center until 1991. So there was a gap between the mechanism and us being a successful cancer center. So you can ask yourself why. I hope you recognize over the course of this symposium, as well as the course of your research life, it really does take a team to actually be successful. And if anything, that's what the Cancer Center is. The Cancer Center is a team that organizes all of you to think about your skills and how you are going to work on the problem of cancer. So Dr. LeBien was a key member of that initial team, along with Dr. Kersey. There are a few other people in the room that were also part of that team in the beginning. I'm looking at Jim McCarthy sitting here at the table. I saw Yoji Shimizu a little bit earlier, who were also involved with the initial Cancer Center grant. But I think the idea that Dr. LeBien serving as the deputy director at that time, along with Dr. Kersey, where I don't know what the right sports analogy is, general manager and coach, or point guard and it's hard to know exactly how to put that in the right sports analogy, but I do want to thank Tucker for everything he's done for this cancer center, for building this culture of collaboration, as cooperation and productivity. I mentioned this at some other earlier events, that Dr. LeBien was incredibly insightful and rigorous in his approach to science, and I think that that's what we want to do as a cancer center. So I can't think of no one more fitting to receive our first Masonic Cancer Center Legacy Award. And I'll bring Tucker to the stage.
So thank you very much, Doug. I want to just, first of all, make sure that the volume is about right so you can hear me, even over in the corners there. Okay, I want to thank Doug, in particular, a great friend for many years, for his leadership. I also want to call out, before I go any further, Lisa Huber, who did an amazing job of organizing this meeting, along with many other people. This is not your father's cancer center anymore. This is a big, bold, ambitious, comprehensive, impressive organization that does absolutely first-rate science across the board. So here's the deal. This is my last talk. This is it for me. I retired January 5th. Endless photos are being taken in case the guy drops over in a few days. This is literally my final talk. So when I spoke to Doug about what I should share with all of you, we decided that I would talk a little bit about my early career and what I did with my colleagues, and then spend a few minutes talking about how you actually form or create a cancer center, and why would you do this to begin with. So that's going to kind of be the essence of this. I'll try to move smartly through these slides, add some vignettes along the way. And for those of you who are early in your career or even in mid-career, I have one little piece of advice for you. You go to lots of seminars. Most of them are on topics that are not directly in your area of research, but you go because they're interesting. So I've always felt that a speaker has been effective in communicating a message if the next day you can remember 2 or 3 things that you learned. They don't have to be complicated. They could be conceptual, practical. It could be, gee, I just thought of a new negative control. Now, you're not going to learn that from me today. But so when you think about, if for those of you who might think about this presentation tomorrow, ask yourself if you learned 2 or 3 things. Now, I'm never going to know whether you did, but that to me is a signature of a really effective speaker. Okay. So I came here in 1977 to do a postdoc with this gentleman, John Kersey, who was my mentor. This is John and his remarkable wife, Anne, who became very, very close friends with my family over the years. John at the time was just emerging as the director of the combined pediatric blood and marrow transplant program, and also, of course, became the founding director. As many of you know, I think all of you should know, we've only had 2 directors, John and Doug, over 30 years. That in itself is a remarkable testimony to not only their stamina, but their breadth of understanding of how you run a complex organization. So I'm going to get back to John in a couple of minutes because we work very closely together. So when I came here 44 and a half years ago, actually close to 45 now, that's really shocking to hear that number. This is what research infrastructure looked like. Well, there was some tissue culture hoods, inverted microscope, a liquid nitrogen tank. This was the secret sauce I'll tell you about in a minute. And all this stuff was not there, including PCR, for example. So all the methodologies that you use all the time in flow, mass spec, molecular imaging of every conceivable kind, southern, western, northern blotting. Some of you may not even know about southern blotting. Any omics, transgenics, knockouts, CRISPR, nothing was around because it hadn't yet been, I'm signaling to somebody special here. So didn't even have, of course, I realize how ridiculous this sounds. Oh, there's this old guy standing up there, how tough it was. No computers, no word processors, it was 0. Okay, but there was the inspiration that one could glean from working with smart people. And that trumps, geez, I hate to use that word. That overcomes a lot of stuff. Okay, what about research facilities? Well, in 1977, we had Moose Tower, Phillips Wangenstein, Mayo, Jackson Howery, and Deal, the old library, and almost all the labs were horrible. If you want to know what kind of lab space we worked in then, that Leo Firk, John Kersey, and I, Lee Wattenberg worked in, go to the basement of Deal Hall. It's frightening down there. All the buildings that you now work in or have become familiar with, Lions, Masonic Cancer Research Building, the first building on the river, Nils Halsemo Hall, Center for Magnetic Resonance Research, Molecular Cellular Biology, McGuire Translational Research Facility, Wallen Medical Biosciences Building, Cancer Cardiovascular Research Building, and the Microbiology Research Facility. And aren't you impressed that the old boy knew all those acronyms? Okay, they were not yet even thought about in many cases. So of course, as a large organization, we're much more mature. The facilities are fantastic. But in the end, of course, it's the environment around you and it's the people you interact with that really make the difference. I love to show this one. So I had some early success, believe it or not. And John Kersey went to the chair of lab medicine at the time and said, you know, maybe we can offer this guy a faculty position. And Alice said, fine. No space, no lab, no office space. I had a desk. No salary support from lab medicine. You know, you eat what you kill. Jim McCarthy knows about this. No research support at all. It came from John or things that I was able to successfully obtain. But I had the title. So it was kind of like the system in other major centers, whether it's Boston or maybe UCSF or whatever. They give you the title, which gives you the opportunity then to compete. So I was so naive at the time, I thought I won the lottery with all this, with none of this. And you know, the lesson here for those of you who are at a stage where you're thinking about moving on or you're thinking about potentially moving up within the university, if you want to get the big startup packages, you go elsewhere. That's the way that it works. And I was not the only one who was in this circumstance, believe me. But I was fortunate to get to be supported by Ellis Benson. Now, there's always a lesson in this. So I submitted my first I had some success making monoclonals. Submitted my first application to the NIH. It got a perfect score. At that time, they scored, I think you know, from 100 to 500. So all 16 members gave me a 100. I got full funding, submitted the identical application to the American Cancer Society, and it got tanked. And one of the reviewers, who we eventually found out was one of our competitors from Boston, said it's not necessary to make any more of these since the important ones are already made. So what's the lesson here? The lesson is obvious. You will not win every time. No one does in this business. You will have papers rejected. You will have grants rejected. Sometimes this will be painful, but you have to persevere. You have to double down, and you have to learn from the circumstances that lead to these adverse outcomes if you want to really get good, because no one wins every time. Not even Steve Hecht. Okay. I had to call that out. Okay. Now I'm going to take a little bit, go down memory lane here. When I so Bob Good, who was a very famous immunologist at the university in the 50s and 60s, had gone to Sloan Kettering, and he came back here on occasion to meet with old friends. And I remember sitting in John Kersey's office with Bob Good, and Good said, you know, I was injecting rabbits with membrane fractions from leukemic cells. And there were some individuals who said that a meeting, how do you define an idiot? It's a meeting between a rabbit and an immunologist via a syringe. So there were, Jim, you remember that? Because that came from Leo Ferk. So this technology had been published in 1975 by Cesar Milstein and George Kohler, for which they won the Nobel Prize a very short period of time after that. But essentially what it did was gave you the power, of course, to generate monoclonal antibodies of single specificity. Now, it's important to realize that at the time, the cell surface of eukaryotic cells, particularly blood cells, the ones that we were most interested in, was a frontier. We knew nothing about what was on the surface. Well, we knew just a tiny bit. We knew there were surface immunoglobulin, Fc receptors, and a peculiar receptor of some kind that bound to sheep erythrocytes to form rosettes. So you could purify T cells by this methodology. That's all we knew. So if you started to make monoclonal antibodies against human blood cells, you should start to get some wins early. So the methodology is shown here. Now, this is not the methodology that's necessarily used anymore with all the engineering and molecular cloning techniques. But you used an antigen. In this case, we used a leukemic cell line. You immunized mice. You harvested the spleen. And then you physically fused those activated spleen cells, probably pre-plasma cells, with a magic myeloma cell line that Cesar Milstein had created called NS1, which was hypoxanthine guanine phosphorybosyl deficient. So when you plated those cells in medium with aminopterin, those cells would die. Normal spleen cells would die. So only the hybrid cells would grow out. And I remember looking at a couple of early reports for how to know whether we were being successful. And you could see these beautiful round refractile clones of cells emerging. And they were, I mean, it was a religious experience to see them. They looked so beautiful. So I spent months getting this method to work. And we do the immunizations, do the fusions, and no clones go out, nothing would grow. And the secret turned out to be this PEG, which stands for polyethylene glycol, which was the fusogen that was used in the methodology to physically fuse activated preplasma B cells to the myeloma cells to generate the hybridomas. And there was all this discussion about lots of PEG, which one was good, which one was not good. So we finally found one that worked. And I had my first student, Candy Abramson, who worked side by side with me. She took a year off from medical school. And I can tell you the euphoria of seeing these clones come up was, I mean, to die for. And so we were very successful. We generated a series of antibodies that eventually defined, in the first workshop, the original panel of CD antigens. Now, I think most of you know the cluster of differentiation antigens, now numbering, I think, about 371, reflects a global effort to define cell surface molecules with all sorts of functional capabilities over a long period of time. And the very first workshops were held to develop a common nomenclature around specific antibodies that could then be used in multiple laboratories to conduct research. And the antibodies we made, BA2, BA3, TA1s, BA5, BA1, and EA5, were used to define, along with a couple others, were used to define these first so-called CD antigens. So we were in very early, And we used these not only to conduct phenotyping of leukemia and some other things that I did with John and Norma, et cetera, but we actually very quickly started to think about whether we could use them to eliminate leukemic cells from bone marrow in the setting of autologous transplantation. So we developed a method, and a protocol was written, a clinical trial was conducted. I actually did the antibody treatments myself in my lab. Why? There was no IRB, there was no HIPAA, there was nothing, no GMP. It was a home on the range. And we did this over a period of 2 years, and I think there were 23 or so patients treated with autologous transplantation. 7 or so were disease-free, 6 months to 32 months out. It wasn't necessarily a success story, but it certainly showed the safety to do this. And I'm really quite proud of this, because I think we were conducting translational research here really before the concept was widely appreciated in biomedical research. And of course, we wrote the papers, as you know, to support all of this. And one of the things I learned early from John in particular was how to develop collaborations with people. Of course, it's not just the research that you do, it's the maturation that you undergo to realize that you can't do it all alone, and that you have to identify individuals who you can be comfortable working with, who you can be confident, share your values, and are rigorous, and have talents that you don't have, look at the problems in ways that you never do, and that's the secret sauce. And so there's a whole list of people on these papers, as you know, most from the university, but I want to call out 2 that were particularly influential to me. Oops. Oh yeah, the Star Tribune did a little something on us in 1982. You can see John in the middle there. He had kind of long reddish sideburns, and then 2 individuals who were released from the Ramsey County Correctional Facility the day before the article was written. Just a sidebar. I mean, the reality is, you can look at him, you can look at me. This is what's going to happen to many of you, okay? It's a fact. Whether you're successful or not, you're screwed either way. All right. Now, this is Clara Bloomfield. Clara was an amazing medical oncologist. She was the first woman to, I think, achieve the level of the rank of professor in the Department of Medicine in 1990. She subsequently moved to Roswell Park Cancer Institute, and then subsequently to Ohio State, where she, Mike Cullaguri, and others built an absolute powerhouse comprehensive cancer center. And I worked very closely with Clara in phenotyping leukemias, in doing studies to compare the phenotypic results with the cytogenetics of the day. And I have to say that she was a fireball of immeasurable impact, who took no prisoners and who was absolutely ruthless in pursuit of her scientific goals. And it was a real honor for me to learn from Clara and learn something about clinical medicine that a person with a PhD wouldn't normally learn. The second individual is Stan Krosmeyer. John and I collaborated with Stan early in his career when he had developed Southern blotting methodology to detect immunoglobulin gene rearrangements in leukemia. So we combined the IG gene rearrangement analyses with monoclonal antibody phenotyping to develop more nuanced classifications of leukemia. Stan is a pioneer, as many of you know, in the molecular basis of cell death. One of the co-discoverers of the 1418 translocation, and BCL2 is the partner gene that comes under the IGH enhancer. He spent his career at WashU and Harvard, and tragically, at age 55, passed away from lung cancer. This is a photo taken the last time he was here for a symposium, and he's bald because he was being treated for lung cancer. I can tell you that he's the most effective communicator I have ever known in science, not only in his speaking skills, but in his writing skills. His papers read like poetry. And if you ever have a moment to go back and look at some of Stan's papers, maybe from the late 80s, early 90s, where he was really getting revved up in BCL2 and BCL2 family members, I mean, it was just a skill that was to be admired and not very often mimicked, I can tell you that. So Stan was a great friend. So I'm going to shift a little bit now, I think, and just talk about how the Cancer Center started, at least from my perspective. So in 1991 or slightly before that, there was no formal organizational structure. There was no Cancer Center per se. There were some entities. I think the building where Health Sciences Education Center is now is called the VFW Cancer Center. I may be wrong on that. Huh? The old Masonic building. Yes. So there were names of cancer. There were Cancer Center names in university, but there's no formal organizational structure at all. We had people doing interesting research in cancer, but they were scattered all over the place. There was no area where people working on cancer worked together. There were no facilities. I just showed you on the earlier slide. Now that should be testimony. There was no MCRB. There was no CCRB. I mean, you people are living you're living in a country club compared to what we had. There was actually minimal or modest fundraising capability because unless you have an entity that has an identity, it's harder to raise money. Now you can raise money, people can raise money and the gifts made to, for instance, oncologists who take care of patients, grateful patients, this is very important. But the power of having an organization as a signpost for raising money is important. The clinical trial process was poorly developed, and I would say we had kind of a modest identity. And the identity of cancer research here was at individual level. It was, well, Lee Wattenberg working on chemical carcinogenesis. It wasn't Lee Wattenberg working at the University of Minnesota Cancer Center. So that basically was the landscape. So why would we pursue NCI Comprehensive Cancer Center status? Well, I mean, for John and I and several others, it's, of course you're going to do that if you want to be a player. Of course you are. There's only 1% of organizations that call themselves cancer centers in the country that have this status. So you want to do this because you want the respect, quite frankly. You want the award that goes with it, the Cancer Center Support Grant that Doug has, let's see, this is your fourth, going to be your fourth renewal. Nobody knows Cancer Center Support Grant renewals more than that person right there. You can recruit faculty with this identity, and we did that. A couple of individuals who I would call out, who we recruited, Steve Hecht, who we recruited from New York, David Lagerspada, we recruited from Frederick Cancer Center outside of NIH. Steve may differ, but you know, unless we had a physical facility and an identity, I mean, why would you come here if this was going to be your focus? It was also a much improved training environment. Many of you are working in cancer research, cancer-related problems, whether it's informatics, biostatistics, fundamental laboratory work, et cetera. Enhanced clinical trial potential and branding rights for the university. This is a big deal for the university, believe it or not. They look at this stuff. The Board of Regents look at this. The president of the university looks at these outcomes. It matters. So what did it take? Well, it took outstanding research in pockets, and I'll show you in a moment. It took this is so important, it took a visionary leader. John Kersey had it figured out long before the rest of us did. He had enough familiarity in his own research and clinical investigative career to know the importance of pursuing this objective, and he was the secret sauce. Dean David Brown and VP Frank Cira were very supportive. The financial support of the Masonic Charities, of course, is legendary. It's legendary. They made the first gift to help start the building. They made this $65 million gift, gosh, Doug, 10, 12 years ago, wasn't it? Longer than that? That was used to fund an amazing variety of research efforts and clinical efforts. The Cancer Center, I'm not sure our Cancer Center would exist without the Masons. And support from the University of Minnesota Foundation, very important. And just about that time, the Masonic Cancer Research Building was built, the building that sits on the river, the 4-story building. I was the first one to move in there, like moving into a brand new apartment or brand new hotel. I mean, it was just, everything was, of course, it was perfectly clean, it was sterile. I had the north side of the 6th floor, the north end of the 6th floor on the west side. That's terrible, that's my phone. Give me that thing. Pass that to me. I deeply apologize for this. Okay. Those of you who know Jeff Miller, he occupies the lab space that I was in. So it was a real thrill to move in there. Steve Heck moved in, John Kersey moved in, Jeff Miller moved in, I think a little bit before Doug's time. There's only a couple faculty still in the building who were there in 1996. But I think, and you know, I've been up there, I've lived there for 12 years. It's aged quite well, and it's still a first-rate research facility. The other thing it took to become a comprehensive cancer center is you had to have a faculty buy-in. I mean, the place, let's face it, if you don't have faculty buy-in for something like this, it's not going to work. So John and I and others worked very hard to convince the Jim McCarthys and the Yoji Shimizus and many other people to work with us to form scientific programs that could be the foundation then for a core grant submission to the NCI. This did not happen overnight. It took a while. We had to make an argument about, well, why do this? What's in it for me? And it's always a fair question. And I think we were successful in convincing them that their careers would benefit by working with us to reach this endpoint. So when we submitted about the time we were gearing up the application, we did have some expertise in these areas that I've listed. I won't mention every person here. And a lot of this was central to the development of the scientific programs that formed the basis for the initial submission to the NCI. And then there was the final push. So we created a senior leadership team that was committed to the singular goal of achieving comprehensive cancer center status. And it's not as though, well, you know, let's pursue this, and, you know, if we get it, that's fine. And if we don't, well, at least we tried hard. I mean, what a pile of garbage. I mean, there was only one outcome that was going to matter, only one, and you had to get it. So John established actually an outstanding external advisory board. We had these, what I call these reverse dress rehearsal site visits to the NCI, where we carted Hecht out there, put him in first class on Delta, brought him out there. And what I can tell you is a true story. When we went to the NCI during one meeting, and there were about 7 or 8 of us there, and you're sitting around with NCI program staff, and you're telling about all this cool stuff you're doing, and oh, we have this new building, et cetera. And when they found out that Steve had moved, there was an uptick on the trajectory. So that was very, very important for us. We had to organize and write a grant application that none of us had ever written before. We obtained copies from other people, but you know, when you write the thing for the first time, you really are starting from scratch. This took a tremendous amount of work to put together. We prepared for the site visit, and quite frankly, we succeeded under the pressure of first-time application. So we applied, we were site visited. There was a waiting period then where the review process has to work its course through, and then Consul has to eventually make a decision. And we were funded. And I remember the day when Mary Suntman, who was the chief administrator at the time, called me and said, come up to John's office. Went up there, and John had just received the call that we were being designated as a comprehensive cancer center. So we had a small amount of an adult beverage. Went home feeling good, woke up the next day, it's time to reload. So I think we had a successful run up to this that took over 7 years. It took people who were committed toward a common goal. You had to kind of take the blinders off and not worry only about your own scholarship, because there was much more to it than that. And I think history would argue that we were successful. So that's about it. I have been retired since January 5th. When you get to retirement, and some of you are a little closer, most of you are decades away, you know, people ask you, well, how are you doing? You know, they're being polite. And, you know, I was fine for the first couple of weeks, as my wife Margaret knows, who's here, and my stepson Colin and his wife Christine know. It was a little bit of an empty space there, because I realized that I had nothing, I had no influence anymore. I had no responsibility, nobody cared, I had no influence, I had no input on anything. That's the way it should be. So I think I made a reasonable adjustment to that. And at the end of the day, my health is good. And I have the good fortune to get, I'll share one other thing. What I didn't appreciate is to be able to get up in the morning when you want to, instead of when you have to. I never really thought about that. That turned out to be a positive. I'm not suggesting that I'm some kind of lazy retiree, but in fact, I am a retiree. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot this. I want to dedicate this presentation to my dear parents who passed away long ago. My father on the left trained here in medical school. He was a pediatrician in Fargo, North Dakota. Practiced until he was 65, passed away 3 months before he was retiring from complications due to lymphoma. And he loved to hunt. He was a very simple man who loved to hunt. My mother, Evelyn, trained as a nurse, but once my sister and I were around, she was I think the old term was a homemaker. She took care of us and helped us to, weather all the things that go on when you're a kid. So I've never done this before, and I'm very pleased. And I know, the old phrase, they'd be proud of their boy. Well, I think they probably would, although my mother would have some specific things to say about whether my tie is straight and things like that. So finally, when I get up, what's my life like? Right here, Tucker the retiree and Leo the Morkie. So this is our little 20-month-year-old Morkie, a cross between a Maltese and a Yorkshire Terrier. And she pretty much owns my soul, if you will. And on days when I'm still thinking about university activities and pondering what I might do next, she's watching over me. So I'm going to stop there and really thank you for staying and thank you for your attention.